Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to our Unlocking Abundance Through Policy panel. Technology constantly moves faster than the policy frameworks designed to govern it. We all know that at a high level. What's less understood is why that gap persists and what actually causes promising technologies to stall between innovation and real-world deployment. Regulators are optimizing for safety, legitimacy, and often use rules built for earlier generations of technology. Companies are optimizing for speed, scale, and customer delivery, while investors are underwriting uncertainty across both. Trying to assess timelines and risk in systems that don't always behave predictably is incredibly difficult. This is what we often call the deployment gap, the space between what is technically possible and what society is actually able to implement. Today's panel is not about whether regulation is good or bad. It's about trying to understand mechanisms that determine whether innovation reaches the real world and how policy can either unlock abundance or unintentionally contain it. Here with us, we have three fantastic panelists today, so I will introduce them from left to right. First off, we have Victoria, who is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Alliances at the NobleReach Foundation, a 501(c) public charity dedicated to mobilizing America's top talent and innovation networks across academia, industry, and government. Her focus is on building institutional infrastructure that connects federal agencies with academic and industry partners, creating pathways for innovation and service that strengthen both national security and economic prosperity. Next, Sam Gray is Executive Vice President of Marketing Development at Second Front Systems. Second Front was created to solve a fundamental problem: how commercial software companies can meet Department of Defense security requirements and procurement processes without sacrificing commercial development velocity. Sam's work sits at the intersection of national security, software, and institutional reform. And finally, we have Billy Nolen, who is the Chief Regulatory Affairs Officer at Archer Aviation. Prior to joining Archer, he served as the Acting Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, meaning he is now responsible for certifying, or was previously responsible for certifying aviation technologies, and is now working to do so on the other side of the table. So yeah, thank you all for being here. We're really pleased that you could make it and contribute to this fantastic conversation. We'll start off talking about the deployment gap that I mentioned. We talk about the deployment gap as if it's one problem, but I suspect each of you sees it a little differently based on where you sit. What do you think most people diagnose about why technologies get stuck between innovation and implementation? What do you think is the problem that what do they think is the problem that actually isn't the real problem?
Go for it.
You know, I think, is this working? I think that a lot of where you hear a lot about procurement gaps, regulation, I think that there's a fundamental problem underlying a lot of our systems, which really comes down to asking the right sorts of questions or knowing what questions to ask. I spent my beginning of my career here in the DC area in Congress, and when I went out to the Valley, joined a small tech company. At the time, it was kind of an odd thing to do, being like a DC policy person. But it taught me a lot about the right questions to ask, how technology is deployed, how it's developed. And coming back to Washington and engaging more in the community here, I still feel like the fundamental gap, taking a step back from the process and the regulation and the procurement, which needs a lot of work, and the requirement structure, is how do we embed more people who can speak the language of technology in the Valley and speak the language of DC. I think when you have more folks that have cross-pollinated between the two industries, you start to ask smarter questions, and asking smarter questions helps you understand where the gaps are for your particular technology or the department that you're at or the agency that you're trying to move forward. And that interchange, right now, I think it's getting a little bit better, but there's still a lot more work that we have to do.
I think one of the biggest issues with particularly anybody who works in the national security space or the federal government is almost all of the policies that are put in place are designed around efficiencies and protecting taxpayer dollars. They're not built for pure speed and scale. So for venture-backed companies or investors that are really focused on that space, you have basically a system that's built to stop the speed that you're trying to go. So And the incentives that are created, that's what the major defense primes then replicate, and that's what they optimize their system for. So we're in a period of sort of pivoting away from that. I think there will always be a place for efficiency and for long-term sort of contracting that can take years. That there's probably more space for that, frankly, in the national security space than there is for pure entrepreneurship. So you have to be able to kind of see what's going to be the 10% or 5% hedge portfolio, the things that you're going to focus on that need speed, that need scale, but you're going to have to design a system that can actually absorb those into this giant bureaucracy designed around efficiency.
If I think about the air transportation sector, which is one of the most vibrant, right? Put this in context. On any given year, we're moving half the world's population. 5 billion people, think of that, right? And so the ability to do all that and to ensure that every time someone takes off, they have a more than just a reasonable expectation, they have a right that they will arrive at their destination safe and sound, right? So that really underpins when we think about aviation, right? It's good to sort of put this in context. Let's just use the U.S. airspace for the moment. On any given day, we are moving somewhere between 2.4 to 2.7 million passengers across the U.S. skies. In a year, we're moving about 1 billion. That's almost 3 times the population of the United States. Every year is what we moved just here. You've got about 55 to 60,000 flights in the commercial flights in the air. On top of that, you've got another 1 million drones, of which 60% are commercial operations. And on top of that, this past year, we did 145 commercial space launches. So into that complexity, you figure out, okay, so how can policy, how can innovation move and certainly get to scale? And I think there's this real opportunity now, and I tip my hat to the administration for trying to think about this in new and novel ways, right? How do we allow Archer Aviation, which is bringing our aircraft Midnight to market? And I love the title of this panel, which is unlocking, right? How do we unlock abundance? And so one of the keys is leveraging technology. So for example, to bring an aircraft to market, any kind, it takes anywhere from 2 to 3 years, just use a regular timeline, and then it takes another 18 to 24 months for another country to validate that, right? So there are ways, so we are certainly looking for ways to do that much quicker as we go forward.
Amazing. It's funny that you each kind of touched on a different aspect, the technical, the institutional, and kind of the cultural shifts that need to take place to kind of push this technology forward and push new technologies forward and be regulated but not over-regulated so they can come to the market, like you said, or we can push innovation forward. The next kind of piece of that is a little bit of the trust that takes place between the government, the startups, and the people, like you mentioned. And kind of government doesn't always fully trust industry's claims about safety, security, and the industry doesn't always fully trust that the government will be a predictable or rational partner. Especially we've seen in recent years with so much kind of turmoil, events taking place in Washington, and investors don't necessarily trust either side to move efficiently or with the speed they need kind of within their returning capital to their LPs or kind of in that investor space. So why is that this fundamental trust problem exist, and how do we design a system that pushes us forward and gets beyond that hump?
I'll take a first stab at it. So as you think about it, again, if I go back to just certifying any kind of aircraft or anything new technology, the goal then is one way of shrinking the trust gap, if you will, right? So how do we get there? We think that the ability to leverage technology, be it AI-aided decision-making, the ability to do in the digital domain. It's, the audience may not expect or know, but, you go out, you build, you design something, you have to turn that back into paper to deliver it to the regulator, right? And that just introduces a lot more time. So we have a real opportunity to go figure this out. At the end of the day, whatever we produce, whatever we do, is certainly in the aviation domain, has to be certifiably safe from day one, right? So that's just something we always say. Technology can never come at the expense of safety, but we can certainly figure out how to shrink the timeline.
And Sam, you sit squarely kind of in between both sides on this, so you might have an interesting take.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of acknowledged trust, and then there's also the unacknowledged trust, the things that you don't even think about. One of the greatest examples that we use for this is Visa. And you don't really think of Visa as a trust platform, but it really is this digital backbone that sits between a vendor, a buyer, and a bank. And all three of those, you can go anywhere on the planet and pull out a little piece of plastic and show it to somebody. They don't need to know who you are. They don't need to know where the money's coming from. They know it's just going to show up, and they trust that all three parties in this transaction are going to get what they hope to actually get out of that. We do the same thing with our platform at Second Front. We're trying to build a trust platform between a software vendor, a software user, and the government. And in place of the bank, you have the accreditor whose responsibility is to protect that network. That's a very, very hard thing to do because you don't see it. It's not like money. You can't touch it, right? It's just this thing everybody fears sort of the risk of software and where's the data going? Who's going to steal it? Is it really what I think it is? So building that trust is incredibly difficult and a hard thing to do. The only way really to do it is kind of like aviation. You just have to do it over and over and over again to the point where, I fly probably half the flights you described, I feel like I'm on, and I trust the aircraft. You get on, and some of it is truly acknowledged trust. I think about that. I see the pilots in their fancy uniforms. I see the maintenance crew looking like they're knowledgeable and they know what they're doing. And other parts of it, you have no idea. I've never been in an air traffic control station. I don't know how that's run, but I trust it.
And for you guys at Second Front, maybe this isn't your position specifically, but is that a relationships game, or is that repeating delivery of these software services to your customers
it's a great question, particularly in government. I mean, we have a very complicated, expensive, venture-backed platform that we've built that is the digital backbone. And there certainly are people in the government who understand that, the CISOs, the IT experts. They really do understand the security backbone of this. But the vast majority of it, we have an equally big part of our business, which is managing all of those relationships. Particularly in the, Department of War, it isn't, kind of the hierarchical pyramid that people assume it is, where there's someone on the top. It is federated across particularly networks. There is not like one manager who says, this is what we're going to call a safe network. We've mapped 700 plus networks across the Department of War. They all have slight differences in how they determine safe and secure.
I'd like to tease out this piece about relationships. We fundamentally believe that trust is really broken between these institutions and have been for the past few decades. We think that what can help rebuild trust is when you have people early in their career working alongside each other, working to solve those same problems. So if you think about an internship that you might have had, or a work experience or a project where you might have worked alongside someone that you might naturally not have come across in your academic pursuits, your professional pursuits. It builds a certain level of trust when you're inside working alongside folks in the government, independent of where you go, whether if you go into a nonprofit or you go back to graduate school, or if you go into the private sector, into VC, or in the startup ecosystem. I think we don't have enough people that have been in the inside, working together, solving hard problems, asking the right sorts of questions, spread out between the institutions. I think we have very concentrated networks of people that have either stayed in one institution or sector for their entire career, and we're hoping to promote just more pathways in between them, and we believe that that will help strengthen trust in between institutions through relationships and through solving hard problems on the inside that might need help from folks, from the builders that are helping support the ecosystem on the outside.
And NobleReach's kind of vision or mission, is that kind of something, you guys have taken that upon yourself to be the catalyst to kind of create that trust in those relationships, and kind of why do you think that mission is so important?
It's interesting when you think about, I think, a generation of workers that helped build a lot of the American economy. The three things that that generation really valued were money, status, and security. This generation, the three things they really value in their career and their jobs is meaning, impact, and flexibility. So when we think about the next generation of CEOs, investors, political leaders, even geopolitical, movers and shakers, we believe that that generation is driven towards something that's bigger than themselves. Right now, there's no shortage of complicated and tough problems to solve, both in the private sector side and in the public sector side. Our mission and our dream is to connect aspiring mission-driven leaders to those problems inside of government, but to say that your career might span not just your government service and your government work, but it might span work that you'll do on the outside. I'm sitting beside two amazing leaders whose careers have spanned that interchange between the public sector and the private sector, and I believe it makes them more aware and more astute in how they solve problems on the outside.
That's great. Moving kind of to something a little bit more tangible, I have a question for both you, Billy, and you, Sam. What's a technology that's kind of currently stuck in that deployment gap? It can be in your sector, something else you've seen, read about, come across, and kind of if you could design the system from scratch about how to push that technology through, obviously safely and thoughtfully, how would you go about redesigning that structure?
Well, it's already underway. I mean, I think this conference came at an opportune time. Just earlier this week, Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy and the FAA Administrator Brian Bedford just did a reorganization of the FAA, where they are taking it and realign it so that it is more nimble and that it is more responsive. There are codified in the law, the Administrative Procedures Act that most federal agencies operate by, require a level of cooperation, but at some point they cut off communication. And they say that you get to this point as you're trying to promulgate a new rule, for example, and you say, well, you're now into an area of ex parte communication, and so we can't talk to you anymore. The ability to have this kind of continuous operation, not only from the FAA or the federal government to industry, but across other agencies internationally as well. So I think we're doing, one of the big unlocks is the fact that our transportation department, our FAA, is also talking to agencies around the world. After all, Archer, we want to sell our products everywhere in the world, right? So that ability to say that we've got a level playing field is fairly harmonized, whether we're in Asia, whether we're in the Middle East, et cetera. Those are the things that are helping us, and we are moving in that direction. We'd like to see it move faster, but certainly I commend them for that.
Yeah, I think particularly in the Department of War, there's an obsession with shiny objects things that go fast and are pretty. And, one of the biggest examples of this is, I come from the aviation community in the Navy, and, we have no shortage of new fighter aircraft, particularly in the Air Force. They're constantly updating them. It takes longer than we'd like. But it took us 40 years to replace our aging tanker fleet because it's not a shiny object. And then where I really see a logjam in that is, the low-hanging fruit that is, the back-end software that's just not exciting to people, but this is where the most change actually can happen. Like, drone companies are awesome. There's 1,000 of them out there. I think that's great. Keep going after that. That's what, there's always going to be videos of secretaries and other people getting up front, and they're going to have drones flying around them because it's a great photo op. Them standing in front of our platform saying, look how secure this software is, that's not a great photo op. Nobody likes that. But that's the thing that we have not designed a system across the entire federal government to really recognize the very simple, when you go into most federal offices, I'm sure you saw this, it's like going back in time. You are using such antiquated technology on the software side, that just needs to be completely overhauled.
And Victoria, you might need or be able to kind of thread the needle between those two answers and kind of talk about, have you done any work kind of internationally kind of increasing that cooperation and the people to put in place across aviation agencies or even our allies internationally who are also might potentially be using the same software or systems that the U.S. is?
Definitely. This is not a unique problem to the U.S., unfortunately. There are many nations, particularly our allies, that do struggle with this. I will say to Sam's point, I do, like, hearing you talk made me realize, like, there is such a focus, I think, on platform capability, but not the actual capabilities of technology. And I think that's a huge deployment gap, especially given where technology is moving towards. Of course, we're going to need the platforms and the hardware is essential, but this back-end capability system that I feel like has been given very little thought or conversation is extremely important to, I think, our vitality and strength. In regards to kind of our international world, we're at the NobleReach Foundation very focused on our domestic challenges right now, but in a previous role, spent a lot of time abroad, kind of building that international cooperation. And I think there's something really interesting that I learned about that experience, which is that American innovation is by far one of the best innovations in the world. Of course, we are excited to partner with our allies, but if you think about the reasons why people come here to innovate and to build their companies is because of our ecosystem. It's our 4-year educational capacity, like institutions like Georgetown that offer not just academic rigor, but things like this that connect you to industry and to government. I think it's our VC, our venture-backed, and our capital market ecosystems that really strengthen and allow companies to start and to build. And I think it's a culture. I think we have a culture here where it's okay to take risks. It's okay to have an idea and build a company and be a leader in that space, and it's okay to fail and you can try again, and we have a culture that really promotes that. And I think what's been exciting for me to see, being a DC born person, is that I'm starting to see that more in the DC ecosystem and the DC space. The fact that Georgetown started this conference a few years ago, we were excited to be here. The first call that you guys made when you started this, I think, is testament to the ways in which DC, I think, is emerging as hopefully a leader in setting the culture and pace of this conversation.
And let me just add to those points, right? The world is no longer willing to say we're just going to wait and see what America does. It's no longer willing to wait that we're going to wait to see what the EU does vis-a-vis EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency. So you've got this level, particularly to Victoria's point, you've got this level of forward thinkers out there that say, how do we look at what's coming out of China? And I say that in a very laudatory way. They're moving at speed. And what drives that is a couple of things. Number one, it's the unity of purpose. Right? There is no fear of technology, if you will. So that ability to put technology to work very, very quickly, as Sam said, you walk into our federal government, we look decades behind. I've been in our control tower. I've been a pilot for 45 years and many, many years as an international airline captain. So, and I've seen sort of the incremental advances, right? But we are now at this real inflection point with new entrants coming into the space, with all types of advanced air mobility. And it is, again, Victoria's absolutely right. We've got to find ways to bring more and more talented young people to the government, take a little bit of that altruism and say, come do something great for your country and help us build tomorrow and beyond that, right? And so I think those are opportunities. And so I love forums like this where we come together and we can kind of thought partner and say, how do we get after this and how do we get there faster?
I'll add one, thank you. I was wondering which one of us would drop that they were a pilot first. So great. Glad you got that out there. And I'll also say we do work across NATO. We have an office in the UK. We're doing things in Asia and the Middle East. And, it's very easy to bash the US federal government, and they are behind, and there's definitely ways that they could do it better. But these are not unique to the US. Like, it is unbelievable. If you think our processes are slow, go to some of our allies, and they make us look lightning fast. It's baffling.
You're making my job incredibly easy because my next question was kind of about thinking about progress on a global scale and kind of understanding that moving faster on deployment obviously increases the risk that something goes wrong, it's not implemented properly, something got overlooked. But on the other hand, being overly cautious or extremely careful can cause us to fall behind. And kind of where do we strike a balance? How do we think about that balance? Is there one that's more important, or kind of you just bite the bullet and say, hey, we're going to go as fast as we can, consequences be damned?
Please.
A year ago yesterday, I was downstate in Virginia with the governor as he was talking about advancing mobility and all the things that Virginia was doing to introduce that. That would happen to be the same night that we had the unfortunate accident in DCA. So the public, I can tell you on a global basis, and I've after traveling the world, there is zero appetite. Right? There's zero appetite to put something that you're going to put people on and say, ooh, it's okay if that is not as safe as it can be, right? We operate to a very high, we typically talk about this in orders of magnitude to say something 0 to the, 10 to the minus 9, 1 in a billion, right? 10 to the minus 8, 1 in 100 million. That's still a big number, but then that's what the expectations are. Now, how can we get there faster? Again, we've talking a lot about speed and closing the gap. One of the quick things that we could do is how we share, the ability to share data simultaneously, if you're talking across regulatory bodies, so that instead of taking 3 years to get through a certification process here in the United States, and then another 18 to 24 months to get to that, so now you're talking 5 years to get your product to market. You can do that much faster. That requires trust, so that is building that level of trust among regulators. That's already there, we're seeing that. And I think just learning to reach out for what it is we don't know. But until we really, I come back to Sam's, until we update those back office systems that help us move at speed, it makes it a little tough.
Yeah, the risk question is a great one, and it's extremely difficult to sort of quantify in a lot of the spaces. But I think, one of the things that we always look at, particularly in national security, is what you brought up, is the risk of inaction. And it's a much more difficult thing to do. All of our systems really in the US, this isn't unique to national security, but they're really built around massively reducing risk because we aren't really in open conflict. When we are, things change very, very quickly. And if you look back, I'll use an example from aviation. A lot of times when I was working in the Pentagon and buying aircraft, you had to reduce risk, particularly risk to life, down to near, as close as you can get to that 1 in a billion scenario for obvious reasons. But at the same time, we're trying to use examples of like, hey, in the 50s, we were building a new type of aircraft every year. The Century series of aircraft were just rolling out one after another. Well, yeah, that came at a pretty high price for the test pilots involved, and the equipment was destroyed. I mean, a third of all the SR-71s we built crashed. Like, we would not accept that at all right now. Like, a single aircraft crashes and it is like a major, major deal. So we have to sort of balance, well, are we actually, leaders like to use the term that we're putting the Department of War on a war footing for acquisitions. Well, what do you mean by that? And where do you want to take risk? Back when I was in the Navy, we used to say, like, everybody wants us to move faster, except when we're talking about building nuclear submarines. Suddenly they want us to be very, very risk averse for very good reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, if you take a look back, and I am reminded of the Sputnik moment, a moment in which you had the capital market and the government come together and really push forward because we had an adversary that we were very concerned about. Can you move at that speed without an adversary at your door? I think is a little bit of the question I sense that you're posing to us. One perspective, Bill mentioned, China and their rate of technology. And I'm very concerned with their deployment rate, with their eagerness, I think, for domination in this space. And I don't think we have an accurate picture of exactly what they're building, because I think they are intentionally hiding a few things. But I do think what we can learn from Sputnik and apply that to the current geopolitical world that we find ourselves in, are going to be moments and there are technologies in which the gear has to go full speed ahead. And, I think that the moment that we're in right now, I agree with Bill, this comes at a very opportune moment where we have, I think, an amazing group of builders, investors that are really investing into America and thinking about ways that we can strengthen our industrial base. And I'm really excited about building that community so that we can hit the gear full steam ahead in particular ways that are going to help us stay ahead of the curve.
It feels as if all of you are kind of talking about we have the people on the building side the technologies, the ability to kind of create those new technologies, and the people who are willing to devote their careers to kind of pushing us forward in place to kind of move everything forward. But it's that the regulation kind of isn't there, the systems aren't in place for us to move that quickly. So is there an incentive issue kind of for those regulators we talk about national security or the Sputnik moment as somewhere we were able to come together and kind of get past that maybe, and kind of, is it going to take an event of that magnitude to push us over the hump today, or is there a way for kind of the incentives to align to kind of get everyone on the same page and increase the speed at which technology is able to be implemented?
I think there's potentially a information asymmetry that we can help to bring the regulators and the builders to the same table. I often feel that throughout my career, I've encountered a lot of information asymmetries. I think sometimes it's like the left hand and the right hand are not talking to each other, and partly it's based on where is our center of truth coming from and how are we approaching those problems. I think I would like to hope that we don't need a Sputnik moment to come together and to push forward, and I believe that we have a great ecosystem of leaders currently in place to confront that challenge. But I do think that bringing the right people around the table, asking the right questions, and really presenting information in a way to help us problem solve together is the right way to approach the kind of balance that I think we're striving for.
I'll just add to that. If you look at, just take commercial aviation, the big jets, right? A Boeing, an Airbus, Embraer, Bombardier, Comac is on the initial rise, if you will. A lot of that information is shared. There's only so many places to go sort of source an engine. And we've seen this incredible amount of innovation that is taking place, right? At least for the FAA, Department of Transportation, they work off of this industry consensus. So they have indeed opened the doors. That I alluded to that earlier. They've opened the doors to come in. Let's have a conversation about what it needs. What do you need to get from point A, your concept, to point Z? You have your type certificate, and you're now a commercially viable product, right? So that is growing. It does go back. I do think competition helps us in this sense. Is that, Lord, we've got 4 or 5 players here in the U.S. who are all in a relatively, sort of equal place, if you will. Some are moving more or less. The opportunity, though, is again to shrink the gap with especially with our allies in terms of how quickly we can get a product to market. And then every time when I sit down with investors, right? Investors are not risk averse at all. What they are is they are averse to uncertainty, right? So our ability to go and build back in this level of certainty. The question I'm always asked, hey, Billy, when is X going to happen, right? And I know you may come to this later. So our ability to be able to present that, do it faster, leverage technology. We're finally getting people certainly within the U.S. government, and even more so around the world, that are thinking, how do I leverage? How do I use, again, AI-aided decision-making? How do we get there in a way that gives us comfort that it's not an over-reliance, there's still a human in the loop, but I can shrink this time, and we can absolutely do it. I'm a strong believer in that. We'll see how it goes over the next, say, 12 to 18 months.
I think there's an assumption that, all policy is bad policy and slows down innovation. I think particularly in later stage industries hit sort of a stagnation point, and there is a role where policy can really be a driver of innovation. There's not a lot of great case studies for this, but one that I particularly like that I don't see used a lot is modern HD TV. That did not exist, and the television industry and the broadcast industry had moved into stasis. There were big broadcasting companies. There were several, big TV companies that made tube TVs, and the technology had basically peaked on where it could be. And it was the government that came in and said, we're not happy with where this sits. We're going to change this, and here is a 10-year rollout plan. And it was very competitive, and there were definitely winners and losers. And out of that came, a much more advanced, more capable system. And that was government-driven, which is a very rare case where you see because it was good policy that drove actual innovation.
It's great to hear. All of that puts us at least very hopeful, or kind of expecting that things will work out in the near future. Colin, kind of moving on to something we've talked a little bit about, but kind of can go deeper on, is talent. And kind of where is the talent? Yeah, exactly. Perfect for Victoria. Where is the talent lacking? What places have an overabundance of talent? And kind of how do we bridge the gap between that? How can we kind of ensure that we're building with the right people, the people who want to build but don't know where to start, have access to the resources to kind of get them there and start their vision?
We see there's like a mechanical gap and problem with things like USA Jobs, which is a very complicated and difficult system. Same when you mentioned, going into some of these agencies, it's just like, you're trying to use an iPhone like 16 and this is like, I don't know, something from back like 20 years ago. I think that takes the process of entrance into the government, applying for a job compared to the private sector is like, 2x times speed in the private sector versus, especially if you want to go through a clearance process as well. So there's a few mechanical gaps there that I think there are ways to work around, and partly through fellowships like the ones that we run offers a more streamlined process to be able to get placed inside of a federal, state, or local agency and to work on hard problems. I think there's a cultural obstacle here as well. When I talk to friends who are engineers who are part of the startup ecosystem, they feel attracted to the private sector because they feel like the hardest and most complicated problems are found in the private sector. Well, that's just not true. I think the government deals with extremely challenging, complicated, technical problems that are partly, as Sam mentioned, really like back-end data infrastructure support that is fundamental to building the capabilities and platforms like Second Front and others that I think we really need to help move our industrial base forward. Part of the challenge, I think, on the cultural side is like, how do you create a demand signal to the next generation of builders that by coming into government and spending a portion of your career inside of government, you will be valued by the private sector, that your opportunities will expand versus contract. And I think that's where I think a larger ecosystem of industry partners, of investors that are signaling, hey, this experience that you're going to have inside of government is really helpful to us because you're going to bring us insights, or it's going to expand your knowledge base of the ways in which industry, government, and academia work together, which is overall beneficial. I think you had this like 20, 25 years ago where there was more interchange. I think now, if you look at the folks that have stayed in the innovation economy, especially the big like Apple, Facebook, now Meta, Google, Amazon, they've tended to stay within the big four, the FANGs. And then if you've had folks in the public sector, you've tended to stay in DC through think tanks or nonprofits or government. We're hopeful that we can mix that all up. And so there's just more overlay between the two. I think a lot of the challenges we see in particular technology areas, AI is an immense concern for many agencies as well as private sector companies. Cyber is another one I don't think gets talked about enough in like this larger domain. And I really think it comes down to like basic good data governance and data infrastructure.
Yeah, I would just add to that, again, I go back and use the FAA. It's an agency. I had 45,000 employees, right? But there are some incredibly brilliant people there, right? You've got chief scientists, you've got data scientists. The underlying systems don't always serve them well because they're pretty antiquated, right? And that ability to get more folks. I look around this room and I see talent at Archer Aviation. We have no shortage of talent, sitting in Silicon Valley, right? Everybody wants to come. It's new, it's novel. It's exciting to say, I could build the next thing that comes beyond the jet age. There are some structural constraints within the U.S. government, right? You go there, there's only so much you can pay. You get to your senior levels, you realize, you say, oh, no one can make any more than the office of the vice president. Now it's okay, 200,000, 250, right? And you're trying to attract talent that, of course, we're hiring in the private sector. But you want that same talent. People will still come to the government because you know what they say, I want to do something for my country. I want to be part of this, again, our mission back to the moon. I look at Artemis 2 sitting out on the pad. If that doesn't give you goosebumps, I don't know what does, right? I mean, this is America, and we do some really good things. And our ability to get tomorrow's generation to say, look, you're the one who's operating it. Help us do it better. I do think we're working it, but we can do better.
Yeah, I think you brought up the point I was going to make, which is on mission. You know, there's a lot of students in here thinking about what that next stage in life is. Like, go find mission, whatever that might be. That might be running an HVAC company in, you know, the middle of America. It truly might be. Like, that can be a really strong mission if you believe in what you're doing. You know, and I think back to the, you know, I think it's the JFK quote about NASA, where he's walking around the halls of NASA and he asked the janitor, "What do you do here?" He said, "I'm putting a man on the moon." And like, find that thing that like really drives you. You know, again, we're a back-end software, you know, compliance software. It's not really exciting, but we empower some of these incredible companies. They don't have to put people onto this like bureaucratic tool. They get to just use us and go faster. You know, they get to, you know, they're 6x faster when they come and work with us, which means they get to put all that energy, all that time into building the end platform. And, you know, over half of our company is made up of veterans of either the Intel community or the DoD. And we all feel that sense of mission of we are solving a real problem. We are actually protecting the security of America. We're doing it on a keyboard, protecting, you know, ensuring that you're administratively, you know, getting all of this bureaucracy done. But for us, that really, really matters. So the technical talent is hard to find. We have to pay them a lot of money because they're in extremely high demand. But what you know, the hardest thing in our hiring process is seeing if that mission matters. If it, you know, we're still a startup, you know, it is long hours, it's weekends, it's the whole thing. And if you don't believe in the mission, you're just not going to get it done.
Yeah.
That's all great. And I think it actually will talk to maybe, hopefully there are some founders in the room here with us today. And kind of as you guys all sit in positions that are founder adjacent, you're interacting with founders on a daily or at least very frequent basis. And kind of, they're often building either in or adjacent to regulated markets. And they maybe don't realize how early decisions about how they decide to shape their company, their business, what they're building are impacted by policy, or hopefully they don't, but they might realize that too late. And kind of, what is your message to those founders about how to think about policy that's changing very, very quickly, or how can they maybe push policy forward in what they're building?
So I'll take a quick step. I advise a couple other, you know, young entrepreneurs who are bringing products to market, and my message to them, and as well as to Boeing, or as well as to anyone else, is to engage early and engage often. But you know, you get many times where a founder, an entrepreneur, is 3/4 of the way through their design, and they've already figured out, I think this is what my design is going to be able to do, and they're rightfully skittish about sharing, right? There's all, you know, around IP and all of those concerns. But the ability to talk to the regulator, to your partner within the U.S. government that oversees whatever, I was very proud of some of the work that the FAA did. Number one of the things it did was to set up what they call a Center for Emerging Concepts and Innovation. So he says, Billy walks in and says, "Look, I've got my Acme eVTOL. It is ready to go." Well, I say, well, not so fast. Let's see, do you have the technical expertise? Do you have the intellectual knowledge? Do you have the bandwidth? Do you have the engineering talent? Can you go make it happen? At the end product is that, can you get to market? Will this be a certifiable vehicle, right? You can go to any museum and see all kind of things that never made it off the cutting floor because they never left the concept stage, or they were uncertifiable, right? So I do think those are just some of the ways is in that early engagement. I can't overstress it enough.
Mm-hmm. There's a saying I heard once and really resonates with this, which is, in the tech community, you know, folks would hear a bill and they would think server. They would think a check. And then folks in DC would hear a bill and they would think, oh, it's a check. So I think that part of building today means that you need to have connectivity into Washington. I couldn't agree more with Bill. What's been interesting to see are the number of Silicon Valley companies or tech companies that are building offices here in DC quite early on. Whether it's a small presence, they'll have some sort of outpost. When I started working in the Valley in 2010, there was virtually no connectivity into DC. There was no one was hiring folks in DC. If when I joined the startup that I ended up working at, I think I was one of a very small percentage of non-technical folks that were there. I mean, it speaks to the nature of how you build, because you do need builders like engineers who can help you actually build your product. But I think the awareness right now is a lot more different in that you need to build relationships with the DC community, with the folks in Congress. And part of it is an education. I often hear companies that are early really just coming into DC and educating, right? Talking about the problems that they're confronting, the product that they're building. And especially if you're early on, like Bill said, it's not like a tell, it's more of a inviting you in to learn with us as we are building this and help us think through how to overcome these obstacles. I think that approach I've seen has yielded much more success than I think coming a little bit later on and building that. I do think one of the problems we have to solve is that lobbying is expensive. And so if you're a startup company that wants to sell into the government, how do you navigate that space? And I've heard of some pretty interesting models now where lobbying firms are extending, maybe a contract to like 3 or 4 startups in the same space so they can pool their resources and hire like a DC-based shop to help them navigate.
Or even venture firms that now have offices in DC,
Right.
and they will lobby or go to bat on behalf of their startup companies or their portfolio. So.
Totally. And so I think it's starting to change now, but I think there's perhaps more creative structures or methods that we could deploy to kind of help level the playing field between that community of startups to engage earlier on in the DC community.
Yeah, I think the education piece is one of the biggest ones. What I've seen, one of the most dangerous things I've seen is where a commercially focused or a non-regulated market focused startup that has success comes into the federal market, and sometimes they do. The worst thing that can happen is an early success because they pattern match that to their experience of where, how fast you can move in pure commercial or in unregulated markets. And then they think it's just going to be that easy. And I've seen a lot of startups actually sort of fail at this. They get a quick contract, they get a SIBR, and they're just like, oh, this is going to be just like everywhere else. I mean, it's a market, it's a game. Like, you need to know the rules of the game, and it comes with education. And I think that, the most valuable thing, like, I have lobbyists and I pay them a lot of money, but like the most valuable thing I get out of them is I don't know that game. I didn't come from that world. I don't know how it works. So like, show me what the rules of this are, and then let's see how we can hack it and work, all legally, but of course, but like, how do you work around within that structure to move at the speed that you want to? But I see a lot of startups that skip that step, and they just try to take their experience elsewhere and force it into the federal regulated market, and it generally does not go well.
And I'll just say it's also evolving, right? Like the federal landscape, and especially if you're working in a particular state, like that legislation evolves, and so does the technology itself. And I often think about, what do you read in the morning? I think is really indicative of the community you belong to. I think if you're in the Valley, things you're reading are probably really related to technical aspects, Substacks and TechCrunch. I think in DC, right, we have CNN is virtually on every TV and every building down K Street. And so the things that you are most attuned to, I think, are related to the ecosystem that you're in. And I think building those bridges and, hiring folks or earlier on thinking about what your DC or government connection is going to look like can ultimately help close that gap, realizing that you're going to have to stay on top of it because it's going to constantly be changing.
That's great, and hopefully that's helpful for someone who's thinking about building, especially because here at Georgetown we're trying to push forward and kind of motivate students to go found companies or businesses around things they're passionate about. So hopefully that's valuable for them to think about. Pivoting a little bit here, kind of in the last little bits of our time, I wanted to ask, what does a successful day look like for each of you? Kind of lighten the mood and have some fun with this. Is kind of what gets accomplished, what news gets released, who did you talk to, what moved forward in your businesses, and kind of how does that kind of work towards your overall goal in each of your respective positions?
Ooh, I'd like to hear yours.
Sure. So I would say we started the foundation 3 years ago with a mission to help inspire and catalyze this next generation of builders to serve, to see the call that government was putting out. And I would say that some of the best days that I've had are when I hear from young people who are deciding about what their next journey and their chapter is going to be, and they make the decision to go into government. And I think it's really inspiring for me to hear young people talk about hearing the call for mission. I think it's been a particularly difficult time in their like school and academic professional career when you think about things like COVID-19 pandemic, when you think about a geopolitical move that has really, I think, forced a lot of the international community to think about their values, and they're right in the middle of that. I think a lot of you are experiencing that from a very deeply like emotional and personal way, and to hear the call of, okay, I'm going to serve my country, or like, I don't know exactly what that means, but I want to be a part of something bigger than myself. It's very inspiring to the work that we do. And I also think that part of what I really value in the day-to-day at the foundation is having the opportunity to sit down with government folks and listen to what their challenges are, and to really think through, not the shiny object, right? But like, what are the underlying problems and systems that we can help you solve so that you can move quicker and further. Those two aspects, I think, really get me motivated and excited about the work that we do.
Yeah, I would say what really excites me, and certainly it's the vibe that we have at Archer, and it is certainly the mission, which is unlock the skies, right? Which allows us to reimagine how we live, where we live, how we move, and how we navigate that, and then bring that level of access on a global basis. Back to my, 8.2 billion people in the world, right? And we move half of them, and there's still people who are not connected. So that's what I think about. You walk in, you've got engineers, you've got folks working, of course, on the technical aspects of the aircraft itself as it moves to the certification. You've got folks working on the flight operational aspects. What will the network look like? And then of course, myself and others, we're navigating the scene here in DC, bringing all that together, which then gives our CEO and founder it gives you the ability to sort of do a gut check. You're probably doing it on a daily basis, but at least on a weekly basis, how are we doing? How well are we progressing? And I think that's a great challenge to have. And it's an exciting product. I go back to Sam's point, right? I love Kennedy's quote, right? Say, we go to the moon not because it's easy. We go because it's hard, right? And to the ability to take on something that's hard and make it look easy, right? If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. This is a spot that not everybody is doing that. So that's what excites me throughout the day. And to Victoria's point, I do find myself doing more and more DC sort of policy stuff and looking at the Federal Register. I know that makes it pretty boring and dull, but it gives you a sense of what's coming, right? There you go.
Yeah, I'll go a little bit more tactical because you guys both did great jobs of really kind of putting us at a high level in the mission. I do government relations and I do investor relations. So I'll say, kind of the two success points for me, we've written laws. And that's pretty exciting as somebody who, watched Schoolhouse Rocks as a kid. I was like, to actually see that process. It's a little bit messy and not, the most beautiful thing. It's not the West Wing, it's more Veep. But, but it's really exciting when that comes out and you're like, we wrote that, we put that in there. That's pretty exciting when that happens. And then, from the fundraising standpoint, I've raised a little over $100 million for Second Front now. And when those checks come in, it's very exciting because we're trying to build something. And that's the fuel that allows us to do that. We are not a profitable company. It is not possible to do what we do without venture capital. And so doing that is cool, we've extended the runway, right? That's given us the ability to keep building this, to employ the 130 plus people that we have, to build this platform that's powering over 100 customers right now on 35,000 workloads across the federal government. That's exciting to build that. But I will say, for all those people who are thinking of going and building it, those highs are very, very rare, and it's amazing how fast. We literally last summer, 2 summers ago now, raised $70 million, and I remember it all came in one day, and it was unbelievably exciting. And literally before the day was out, we were already on to the next fire, the next crisis, and you kind of you celebrate and then you just move on. So it is brutal, it's hard, it's completely worth it. I advise everybody, please, at some point, work at a startup. You don't need to stay there, but it's amazing how quickly the highs disappear.
That's great. Our last question for each of you, we'll keep it brief with the time that we have left, but imagine it's 2030, so 4 years down the line. What is one concrete change you've made and how technology and policy interact? And what would convince you that we've made progress? Billy, you can kind of speak to aviation, sure. Sam, defense acquisition, and Victoria on that public and private collaboration.
2030. 2030, we've got 4 million drones operating in the NAS. We're doing 75,000 commercial flights. We're doing 250 space launches a year. And by 2030, we've got, I'm going to say, 5,000 eVTOLs or some permutation thereof, right? And that all comes because we've got this alignment around the administration about vision, about policy that we've been talking about all morning, and all that coming together. So I see that happening in 2030.
Amazing. Looking forward to it.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah. What I really, so I spend most of the last 7-ish years in defense tech, and by 2030, I hope that we have no less than 5 IPOs of defense companies. This has been a major focus for a lot of people since really about 2015 of this venture-backed ecosystem. We really have 2.5 winners in that space that you can point to. It's Palantir, it's SpaceX, and the 0.5 is Anduril that is everybody's pretty sure is going to be a winner here. In 25 years, that's not a market. Like, that's a one-off, and we need to see multiple IPOs and look at these becoming enduring companies.
And by 2030, I think for us on the talent side, what would be really exciting would be, one, a new hiring authority that would allow for early career technologists to seamlessly enter into government at different stages, whether the local, state, or federal level. And I think ultimately a vision that we would love to see would be thousands of early career technologists that are going into the government for a 1 or 2 or 3 year stint before going on to something else, and actually having a community around that. Who to go to, and you have mentors and you have friends and a kind of an ecosystem around you that helps you navigate the types of projects that you'd like to work on and the folks that you surround yourself with. And then there's an exit ramp of I know how my skills are going to be valued by the private sector, by the nonprofit sector, by the academic community, and there's, I think, inherent trust in between the three. I think ultimately what we're hoping to build by 2030 is a renewed sense of trust between the academic, government, and industry institutions.
Wow. Well, a huge thank you to all three of you. Thank you very, very, very much about an interesting, informative, and honest discussion about regulation and policy. With that, our Unlocking Abundance Through Policy panel has now come to an end. Coming up in the next few minutes, we have a fantastic panel on defense, technology for the tactical edge. We hope you stick around for it. That should be in about 5 minutes. But before that, a huge, huge round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all for coming, and thank you guys.